pictures of animals up here, but I just did, they weren't coming to me. I wasn't having moments of brilliance. So this is a lot of text. Here's some, let's just split this. A little bit of information for you on one specific aspect of this. So what we talked about was trying to think about when you inherit animals. Again, be it you're new to a string, new to training, or working with those animals, or an animal comes brand new to the facility. So what if that animal comes with a reputation? How do you deal with these kinds of issues? So that's what hopefully this will be about. It's a topic I've never really thought about, in all honesty, but it was kind of fun. So the first thing that I think is super important is to use historical information. Gather as much information about the animal as you can. Try to stick to the facts. And what I mean about sticking to the facts is avoid the emotional labels as best you can. You know, the animal's a jerk, the animal's super sweet, whatever it might be. So try to stick to the facts. Learn about the animal's history. If whether they're coming new to the zoo or you're new to working with the animal, do they have a history of aversive training? Because that's certainly going to, or aversive handling, even like daily husbandry stuff. Have they been hosed from one point to another, or somehow forced to move from one point to another? Are they hand raised? Certainly that's going to alter an animal's behavior. Did they come from a situation of having an inadequate environment? Maybe socially, or the physical environment itself was inappropriate. You know, all of these things, the history of the animal, not that we can change it, but this is going to shape and mold who they are and how they behave, particularly towards humans, but also how they behave in their environment. And so I think that we can't ignore that information. And it might make us a little more empathetic to what they're experiencing and why they're behaving the way that they are. And then we may think, oh, if this animal came from a really small space before, again, I was thinking about this when we were talking about the cougars today, is these drug lions, and I know you have had lots of rescue animals here, but these drug lions that we worked with, they would not come out of their little dark den because they had been in somebody's basement. So their whole life was in this little dark space. And it could have been a matter of, oh yeah, let's target train them and do all these things to approximate their movements outside on exhibit. But what worked best for them was just creating like a transitional zone that was a lot of heavy brush and almost like a brush tunnel, so they could feel safe. And then once they made that step on their own and literally stepped outside, then they were okay. But they needed something between darkness and big bright world. So their history was super important in making that decision of how we manage this situation. And I kind of mentioned this earlier, but if the animal's been labeled as sweet or aggressive or, I don't know, stupid, whatever it might be, try to form your own opinion. If somebody, and heaven forbid, I hope this isn't the kind of information that would come through on a animal transfer sheet and data transfer sheet, something like that. But if somebody else has assigned an emotional label to the animal, form your own opinion. Try not to adopt somebody else's emotional assessment of the animal. If they give you factual information, when you do this, the animal behaves aggressively. That's not emotional, that's fact. And that's how the animal behaves. But just labeling them as smart or stupid or whatever is kind of what I'm talking about. Read the records if there are any. Obviously that's pretty important information. And if it's a new species to you, certainly do your best to learn about the animal's natural history and behavior, because some of what you may think of as bad behavior could be perfectly natural. And I think this is particularly important maybe for some birds or animals who have a really distinct breeding season where they become very territorial and therefore aggressive. It's like, who were we talking about? Oh, hornbill, right? Is it hornbill?
Curacao.
Curacao. Always the curacao. Always the curacao. Yeah, I mean, are these behaviors natural and normal, and probably no amount of food that we have is gonna train out that kind of bad behavior, because that animal's behaving in a species appropriate way, and really we shouldn't want to change that. So stay in the present. You know, the animal's got a history, but be fair and look at the animal here and today in consideration of their history, and form your own opinions about what they're doing here and now. Use problem-solving techniques. You know, I'm a big fan of asking lots and lots of questions. For those of you that were in the lemur problem-solving yesterday, we were 2.5 hours? And took a couple of hours, and I mean, we spent a long time like trying to get to the root of what might be the cause of this problem. So it took us that long. For those of you that have been through problem solving, you know, we assess the situation, ask lots and lots of questions, and then we develop hypotheses as to why the problem might be occurring. So in our 2.5-hour time with the one little lemur, we got to hypotheses. I mean, I felt like it was a bit of a struggle to get the information that finally went, now I think we're starting to get something real. So it's not always an easy thing just to say, ask questions and gather information. It's not like you're going to flip through the records and automatically read it, or read a book about the natural history. I mean, sometimes you have to delve pretty deep in there. But in the end, it ends up being worth it.
Stephanie was very patient with us while we did those all those questions.
Yes. Can you explain that again? Observe the behavior. You know, what is the animal really doing? Do you think that any of their misbehavior, bad behavior, undesirable behavior stems from fear, frustration, mistrust of people, any of these types of things? Because clearly these are going to have a significant effect on the animal's behavior, ability to cope and deal with, you know, their current situation, deal with people, all of those things. And just a reminder to use behavior management. It's not just about training. It's about training and enrichment and the facility and how you go about your day. Are there adjustments to any of those things? Actually, I feel like this time since I've been here, we've almost talked about more enrichment strategies as solutions for some problems, thinking about the mountain lions. And we talked about those guys, the curacao too.
We talked about how we tried it. We're currently using shifting. So.
Get them out of the way.
Yeah.
But anyway, yeah, so the point is you have this, you know, set of tools and strategies that you can use for resolving problems. So, of course, we all love training, but it's not always the best or quickest solution. So again, thinking about these labels that animals might have. I actually was polling the office this morning saying, what are the things that you hear animals labeled as? Aggressive is typically one. I mean, some people might take it a notch further and say, oh, he's just an asshole or whatever. There might be some additional layers on top of that. But I think aggression is probably one of the biggest labels that animals receive. And aggression, you know, animals aren't just aggressive for no reason. They're doing it out of some feeling of needing to defend, right? So it's like a secondary emotion. And really important, it's not the animal's fault. They're responding to something in their environment, either a human or feeling unsafe in their space that we've given them. You know, there could be a number of reasons why they feel moved to aggress. Maybe they don't have the opportunity to escape. If you think about flee or fight, if they don't have the opportunity to flee, then they feel like they must stand and fight. So you get this overt aggression. The dominant, I wanted to bring this point up, the dominant animal versus the dominant keeper. Perhaps it's more applicable in days gone by, which I hope, but sometimes we all get a bit stubborn and just want that animal to do that thing, and we start to lose our temper, and maybe we yell at the animal or do something that's a little inappropriate, and then you start to puff up and come up, and then that makes the animal more defensive. So this is really a bad situation, particularly for an animal who is kind of a dominant animal. And certainly you wouldn't want to be threatening and yelling or behaving that way to a subordinate animal, because then you're really gonna frighten them. So if you feel, I guess if you feel yourself becoming the dominant keeper or aggressive keeper or something like that, take a step back, take a breather, hit the reset button, because ultimately that doesn't serve anybody very well.
I think that can also be common when, maybe not common, but occur when you think that you're, and you may actually be able to do it in some instances, control an animal's behavior who might be being aggressive towards another animal in a social setting.
Ooh, that's a
I
really
mean, I
good
think
point.
one of my best, life lessons in animal care came many years ago with Donna Elephant. And of course, I was in free contact with her and did have a dominant relationship over her. And in the early years of switching to protected contact, on occasion I would try to use, that prior relationship just by voice when she would be aggressive towards the other elephants. And at times it would work, where I would say, Donna, no, Donna, back up, and, use my, very firm, dominant voice, and she would respond. And then at some point Donna realized that I didn't have anything to back it up. And I remember very distinctly one day, I used that tone and I told her no, and she looked right at me, and then she turned and gouged Madunda way harder than she had the time before. And I think it was like, you're not in this. And it was definitely a lesson, and from that time on I realized that I need to use other ways of trying to influence their social interactions and aggression, because I was just raising the level of aggression overall. But it's such a, you're wanting to protect the other animal and trying to have a positive influence, but at least in that instance, it was very clear to me, it's like, not so much. I don't think Madunda was thanking me that day for helping out.
Getting back to our Curacao friend, this is definitely an active issue with him as well, where I am probably the only person he has aggressed the least on. He's followed me, and that's about as far as that gets, but I think part of that is because I have caught him up in the past, so he knows I kind of have a backup behind that, so I'm like the only person that has caught him on a repeated basis. And I've also taken the time, however, to spend with him when he's not being aggressive, and also take that time to hand feed him and build the relationship not in that dominating factor either. So that balance, I think, was really helpful, but because of this heavily ingrained territorial aggression that happens every breeding season, and I think it's worse because he's established now versus the past years where it was a new space, so it wasn't established. So having to step in and kind of not run away from him in his view was beneficial, but now we're looking at shifting, so trying to avoid the whole situation altogether. But it definitely building the positive relationship and not being afraid of the animal in this free contact setting is also really important, to not feel like you're running from the animal, but spend the time to build the positive relationship when you can.
Yeah.
That's a hard one. Yeah, and then like you were saying, the social aggression with him actively chasing some of the other animals in that aviary. It's very frustrating sometimes. Very, very frustrating.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, it's natural where we can see, like Colleen said, you want to protect the others. You want to protect the little guys, whether they're smaller or emotionally smaller. But you want to protect them. And so you can see how these labels for animals emerge. Oh, he's being such a jerk. Well, he's not being a jerk. He's just being a Curacao. And I think stepping back from that really helps me reset my mind, and where, finding those opportunities, like you said, where can you find opportunities to form a positive relationship? How can we mitigate this through the breeding season? This too shall pass. Excellent points. Okay. So I think I had several examples of this Indu, for those of you that email me, my email address is Indu. She's also an elephant. She's at the Phoenix Zoo. Now, she used to be at the Houston Zoo, and when we were starting protected contact training, if you looked through Indu's records, you would see things like Indu was bad today, put in barn in a stretch, which is sternal recumbency, put in the barn in a stretch and disciplined. Put in barn in a stretch and disciplined. So Indu knew what the behavior stretch was if you asked her to do it, and oh, she'd get real mad. She would punch you and walk away, or stomp her foot. She would do something to let you know, we don't do that anymore, and walk away. And this went on for years. So occasionally we would ask her to do the behavior, still mad about it, okay, we won't ask you again. Well, we were in the process of training some of the youngsters to do the behavior, and one of them did it for the first time, like boom, perfect, drop right down. Everybody, I actually was with Indu. Somebody else was training the baby, and we're all looking at the baby, yay, good job, you know, stupid, yay, we're so excited, happy camel dance. And then I hear this weird noise, and I look over, and Indu's in a stretch. So my feeling is she suddenly decided it was safe enough to do this behavior that had been so frightening for her before and elicited such a strong negative reaction when we would ask her to do it. It still gives me goosebumps and almost makes me cry.
How do you reinforce her? How do you reinforce her?
Manna from heaven. I think I dumped the whole jackpot in the whole bucket. I'm like, yeah. And then just a couple of other quick examples. Sabu was an elephant that was in Ringling. He was born in a zoo, sent to Ringling when he was 3 years old, castrated, lived at Ringling till he was 28, and then he went to Paws, and he was enormous. He weighed 17,000 pounds and had terrible degenerative joint disease. He was in a lot of pain. And when Ringling brought him, and when they brought him and unloaded him, those guys were terrified of him. They had hot shots, they had hooks, they had like every torture instrument that they could have. And I mean, they're like, oh, he set you up, get out of the way. And here's this big old guy, he just kind of comes backing off the trailer. His legs are all swollen up from the transport. He was not feeling great. It didn't seem like he was going to be aggressive. And I don't think we ever saw one instance of aggression from him. I mean, he never saw another hook or hot shot again. But it was so bizarre, like it's burned in my memory, the way these elephant handlers, circus elephant handlers, were reacting to this guy. And then all we saw from him was cooperation, some fear, but really no aggression. So it was just such a remarkable, you know, if we had just read a form that said, this animal's super aggressive, you better look out, it seemed like such misinformation. And then the last one is Joey, a chimpanzee. He was actually the first, I believe, great ape, certainly chimp, trained on voluntary blood draw, and he also was a circus animal, performing animal, and he knew more about human behavior than most humans. I mean, he was quite savvy at manipulating and training people, and he was also willing to tolerate some pretty horrible things from people. He would refuse to shift. No amount of aversives would make him shift until he was good and ready, and then he would make his decision to go ahead and shift. And he was actually pretty instrumental, I guess, in convincing people at this facility that positive reinforcement would work. So he was started on a positive reinforcement program, loved it, loved training, is to this day a superior training candidate, student, participant, teacher, everything. And he learned blood draw straight away. He has a medical condition that requires monthly blood draws, so he learned blood draw straight away. I mean, he's just a remarkable animal, and he made believers out of people who said, oh, that guy's an asshole, he'll never do anything for you. You know, they just had this opinion, an emotional opinion of this animal. And so simply by taking a step back and going, now wait a second, let's look at what his motivation is and think about how we can change the relationship with him, everything changed for him. And I mean, his life became better and people's lives became better too. So those are my 3 stories. Now I would like for you to tell stories. I thought just another, I think, label that might come forward is an animal's lazy, or maybe they're not food motivated or something like that. So I think, again, taking a step back and looking at motivation, I mean, most animals truly aren't lazy just because they're lazy. They may have some other reason that's keeping them from doing what you want them to do. So again, it comes back to motivation. Is something more motivating to do nothing, to be lazy, than is motivating them to do what you ask them to do? And I think if you know, do they have a medical condition? Is there some root cause of their lack of motivation? Can you tease it down to those elements? And I mean, there are, of course, some animals that are difficult to like really dial into what motivates them, but I think most of the time we can get there. Sweet. Some animals might be labeled as the sweetest ever, and perhaps they are, but I think we want to be a little bit cautious about how we use this, particularly if we're training new people or transferring the animal to another institution or facility, because if you label the animal as sweet and never aggressive, you know, it could be like the opposite of Sabu, always aggressive, and we didn't really see any. He was sweet. But if we sent him to another facility, maybe those aggressive tendencies will come out again. So you don't want to set somebody else up for an accident or injury. And certainly you don't want to set the animal up to feel like suddenly they need to be aggressive because people took advantage of their sweetness. And certainly a change in environment, if you move the animal from one facility to another, could certainly alter the sweet factor. If they're suddenly less comfortable in their environment or less comfortable with new or different people. The animal's old and it won't do anything. It's hitting a little close to home these days, but I think that yes, old animals can learn to change their ways. Why are y'all eyeballing each other?
Zebras.
Old zebras.
We're tapping ourselves. Good job, Yara. Good job, Stacy.
As long as you weren't saying down.
No. It was agreeing. It was like, you are
Good.
correct.
Excellent.
The
Excellent.
zebras had all the labels of all those things.
Yeah.
And they're like, but what if we just do it anyway?
It's the attitude. So, I mean, of course, it is important to, you know, are there medical concerns with older animals? They may have reduced mobility or things like that, but it doesn't mean that they're stupid and they can't learn. So, if you use your good positive reinforcement techniques, maybe you adjust some objectives, you find out what really motivates them, you make it worth their while, then, like with the zebras, you can overcome labels and accomplish amazing things. And the last label that I well, actually I think Diane thought of this one. The last label that we came up with was the animal's just not food motivated. He won't work, he doesn't care. And I guess sort of along with this is they don't like the target. They don't have to like the target. You do have to find some way to reinforce them for touching the target, but they don't have to like it. And really, they don't have to like anything except the reinforcement that we're giving them. They don't even have to like us to cooperate and achieve behavioral objectives. So an animal may not be food motivated, but it's certainly worth exploring other types of foods, maybe other presentations. If you use sweet potatoes, cook the sweet potatoes, or you know, some other way of presenting the same food item. And I think this also would bring to mind the importance of secondary reinforcers. And if you have an animal that truly isn't super food motivated, you may actively use secondary reinforcers much more than working with somebody who is more overtly food motivated. And the other, I think, thing that came to my mind was, what if an animal just isn't comfortable taking food from you? That doesn't mean they don't want the food. that means they want to stay away from you more than they want the food. So that's the motivation to not take the food from you because you're so scary, I'm more motivated to stay away from you. So finding ways to deliver the food and bridge that gap. It doesn't have to be, here, take it from my hand to your mouth. You can toss the food or create some distance so the animal becomes more comfortable taking it. And I've really seen this a lot, particularly with hoofstock coming from open range or very large kind of situations, and they're used to, maybe they only eat pellets and grass, and then you go give them a carrot, and they're like, what's that? They don't even recognize, sort of like Eugene and his dark box. You know, they don't even recognize these items by sight as food. So you have to almost teach them to eat something that you want to give them as a reinforcer. But it doesn't mean they're not motivated, it just means they don't understand and know.
We had that with Mabusu giraffe, where for like years we were like, no, all he cares about is the females. All he cares about is the females. And then we started, all of us, putting in more time with when he wasn't distracted by the females, doing basic training and giving bananas. And over the span of a few years, we now have a much more responsive, like, oh yeah, I like bananas, and he will focus even when he's interested in a female in a way where it took some teaching and it took some opportunistic window of time, but we didn't think he was interested in food and reinforcement, but we got to a place where he was. So,
Tenacity. And that's really all I have. I was, hoping for some more. I just kind of wanted to throw these ideas out there and see if you guys have any more input or thoughts on this. Do you ever find yourself falling into the trap of labeling an animal? Find frustration trying to get out of it?
I think sometimes it can be difficult because even if you are, someone else tells you the labels or tells you the things, and you might not necessarily believe it, often, other instances will occur that can solidify that idea. Where, something can happen and you're like, oh, I totally understand what you mean. And then it's like solid kind of thing. And I think it really takes different situations to kind of wiggle away from that. And I think it just is often on our shoulders to just actively try to wiggle away from that. Because I think it is really easy, especially if it gets passed to you. It's often from someone that has experience, that's been here for a long time. And so you kind of want to take it all and say everything that you say is real and true. You have to actively question it. I think it can be really difficult, especially when there are elements, I'm sure, of their behavior that led to that to begin with. So you're going to see things that may support it. And I think it's difficult, but definitely possible.
Have you or anybody else found any helpful techniques to do exactly what you're saying and work away from that?
For me specifically, leaving the situation and seeing another setup. So going to a different giraffe facility, going to a different hoofstock facility, and seeing just a different, because I know Leslie is a huge, she'll often say, even for us that work every single day, we see the same thing, so we pass by the same, hole in the wall every day, and we don't notice it just because we're there every day. And I think it takes jarring and going into a different situation, seeing a different setup, different things, and then you go back and you go, oh yeah, and you can kind of see it differently. So that's personally helped me.
Perfect, yeah.
I think labels in the citizen world is a huge thing, and for them, almost 90% of the aggression is based out of fear in some way. And dealing with labels and parrots is always a major issue because it's almost always fear, especially when it's birds that don't know how to fly, they can't escape literally any situation. And so dealing with, a new person walking up, people forget that you're 100 times this animal's size, and you're trying to put a piece of food in its mouth when it doesn't know you, it's had bad experiences, whatever the past is. And sometimes they are testy, but sometimes, most of the time, it's fear-based.
I also see that, sorry.
no, go ahead.
But I also see that with parrots too, where they get a reputation, and then so everyone treats them differently from a whole different point of view, and it just becomes this cycle.
And that was part of mine was, I find that first thing I have to tell myself if I get frustrated, with giraffe usually, because they're so slow and stubborn, is I don't care what the label is in my head right now, it's not that animal's fault, they live at this facility and it's up to us, it's not up to them. And then, once I get past that in the moment frustration, I would say what has helped us, again, specifically with giraffe, Sudi was labeled as untrainable and aggressive and all of these things, and we just started over, like, okay, can we feed her bananas for doing targets, and we got to a place where we could trim her sore foot. And not me particularly, but that's what we as a team did, and again with Maggie, Maggie didn't like anybody, and she had these super negative experiences, and we just started with, how about just relationship? How about just feeding you and you not being angry at us anymore? And then you start getting places. So I think it's just, if you have that label and you're not sure what to do with it, and it even might be true, can you start over?
But it actually is a tag off of what you're saying. I like what Jessica was saying. I think the hardest thing to do when you're looking at a situation where the animal has a label is to somehow put new eyes on it, and maybe going to a different place helps to refresh your eyes or somehow reset. And then what you were saying, Amber, with the animals acting aggressively because they're fearful, I think Alicia and I also dealt with a label of an animal acting aggressively because it was bored. Because I remember the one thing that always made me laugh is that when you and I inherited string 9, was, I'm not disparaging Jason, but one of the funny things he said was that Bingo had an evil eye. The look on his face was an evil eye. So he's not saying Bingo's a bad bird or Bingo's, but obviously when you use a word like evil, it's kind of, putting a label out there without specifically labeling him. And so then Alicia and I learned that I don't believe that it was so much an evil eye, but it was more like a bored eye. What can I do? And I'm going to make stuff up, and you're probably not going to like what I make up. So, and he ended up being our star pupil because he was so. I think his evil eye was more like attentive eye, maybe.
I think it's just his face. He just has a grumpy face.
But it's the label that we ended up inheriting. It's oh, he has this. Okay.
I think something too that is always good to sort of take a step back, and it helps me because of course, most of my training is with elephants and dogs, and then little bits here and there. And you see these other animals with some of their different situations, and what always helps me is to think about the natural history of that animal and the behavior of that animal and how is that playing into its response. And the giraffe for me are, I think, a really good example of that. The things that I can think can be most frustrating to the keepers and, people working with them, and, even a million years ago when I was shifting them, is just walk through the frickin' gate. Why are you so stubborn? Why? And they're just staring off into the distance, and, blank appearing, but it's this is an animal that has to really be conscientious about its surroundings, and it has this great ability to look at great distance, and what the hell do I know is however far away. I can't see what it's looking at necessarily, and it's that really helped me with those situations with the giraffes and with the different parrots that I've worked with, little bits of time, recognizing that these are highly social animals, that interact with each other, with their bills, and then here come us humans, and, we have such a tendency, even with our knowledge of animal behavior, I think we have such a tendency to relate to them in our human way, and not always think about, what is their normal behavior, how do they normally interact with each other, how do they normally interact with their environment, and I think often that is part of the explanation as to why they're behaving the way they are.
I feel like labels too are something that is really hard to get away from. Not necessarily because we're using them on a professional level, but because we get frustrated or we're trying to talk to somebody after just dealing with a giraffe who won't walk through the frickin' gate. Or the macaw that won't stop opening his beak and threatening me. And we all get frustrated and we all use them. And I don't think that's the worst thing, as long as we know that that's not applicable in the professional sense.
And it's not a reflection of the animal itself, it's a reflection of what made them that, yeah, their frustration of whatever,
Yeah.
I just get
Yeah.
up to that point.
Absolutely.
Yeah, their circumstances and their relationship with people.
I kinda wanna use Margaret's like, hi, I'm Amber and I use labels.
Yeah. Right.
And know that it's, you know, it's something that we kind of have to use sometimes for communication reasons, but that there's more behind it and that the goal is to, just like baiting, name it out
Yeah.
and not use it and find the real meaning behind everything.
And that actually segues into, for me, the paper that I passed out to you, which is on transferring behaviors. I think the reason it segues is when you use that type of language, and I use it as well, I'm not, believe you me, I'm not saying I'm up here on a pedestal not doing it. But when you use it when you're teaching new people, then the risk of damage is much greater. Which then leads me into the transferring behavior thing. I don't know why I felt compelled to give you something in case this gave you nothing. I wanted you to have something to walk away with, I guess. But it sort of goes into the issue of when you receive a new animal from an institution or you're new to a string, how do you transfer particularly training behaviors from one person to another. So that's all this is kind of a guideline for how that can be done. It's not written in stone, it's not gospel, it's just one example of how you might choose to do it. So I thought I would just share that with you, so that you had a door prize.
You turn to reinforce this.
I'm not sure if it is. Hopefully it's not punishing.